All right, here you all come one by one. How you doing? Hopefully you guys are all well. I'm looking forward to the weekend here, the last weekend for Christmas. Cookie decorating, present wrapping, right? Sleeping. Yeah, I know how it is. Well, so we're going to have a only morning class this morning. So I'm giving you a little gift right off the bat, right? That's my little Christmas gift to you. We are only going to have class this morning. We won't have class this afternoon. So there you have it. So in interest of that, we're going to try to be efficient this morning and do our business so we can finish up here in the usual allotted time. So you should have all got an email from me that has your graded exam in it, okay? Should have your score on it. I'm going to talk about the exam at the end of class, okay? So after we're going to talk about Chapter 19 here on international trade. There's not a lot in Chapter 19, to be honest with you. Most of what's in Chapter 19 is review from either principles of macro, or for those of you who've taken money and banking, there's actually some review from money and banking in this. And so, we're not really covering a lot of new difficult ground today. So we're going to do that in pretty quick order. And then, as I said, after that, I'll go over the exam. And then after the exam, I have a little bit of time after class that I can just stay on Zoom and meet with you individually in chat rooms, or you can send me an email and we can set up a Zoom time to meet this afternoon. I do have a couple of times that are blocked out this afternoon for other meetings, but I do have like a window between 12:30 and 2, and probably from 2:30 to 3:30, roughly in there. So anyway, we'll talk about the exam. And as I said, I want to make sure that I have time. If any of you want to talk with me individually by Zoom, we can do that this afternoon or right after class, okay? Before we jump into Chapter 19, let me remind you of a couple of things that should be on your radar. First off is your macro paper, right? And that is due Monday morning at 9 a.m. What's the hardest thing about this paper? To me, I guess there's really two things that are hard about this paper. The first is there's a lot in that article, right? There's a lot in there. It's a 4-page article and you're supposed to write a 3 to 5-page paper on it, right? So I think one of the hard things is just kind of figuring out what you're going to talk about and what you're not going to talk about, right? Do not feel the need to talk about everything in that article because you can't do it, right? So I think that, one of the hard things is to figure out what you're going to talk about and what you're not. In the prompt for the paper, I give you 2 questions, and I really encourage you as much as possible to try to focus in on those 2 questions. Not to say that there's not a lot of other stuff you could talk about, but once again, I think given that the paper is not a long assignment, try to focus in a lot, right? And remember that it's not technically a review of the paper where you have to talk about everything, right? I'm really asking you some specific questions that I want you to talk about. And of course, when you talk about it, use class material, use our models. That's what I'm really looking for here ultimately, is to use your models, to show me that you can use the things that we've learned about in this class and apply it to the real world, right? And apply it to current economic thinking. So, keep that in the back of your mind, is that you really want to be using your models, right? Using our models, and as much as possible, try to convey information through the use of models, because models allow us to convey more information more quickly and more clearly, right? That's one of the big advantages of models. I would say the other big problem or other thing that you should think about in terms of this paper is, organization is just hard. When there's a lot that you could talk about, I do think that there's always a tendency that the paper could be, well, then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then the end, right? So think about how you can connect your thoughts, right? Think about how you can connect your thinking. And once again, that's where using models can be very useful to you, right, is they can help you connect one idea to the next by giving you a framework in which you can talk about things. So my hope is that the paper is not so difficult in terms of the analytical complexity, but the difficult thing here is taking some information and kind of putting it in a cohesive, coherent argument, right? And so it's a good practice in writing. Writing clearly is thinking clearly. I think we all know that, right? And so that's really what I'm asking you to do in this paper, is to think clearly about this article from The Economist and see if you can convey clearly what you took away from it, right, in terms of our macro model. So that will be due on Monday morning, right? Monday morning at 9 a.m., right? If you have questions or any confusion, you can always send me an email and we can talk about it over this weekend. Later today, I will be sending you the last homework number 5. Homework number 5 will be due on Tuesday morning, okay? So you can begin work on it this weekend if you have a little bit of extra time, but it won't be due till Tuesday morning. Homework number 5 is definitely shorter than your other homeworks, right? So I've cut back the size. I think there's still 9 or 10 questions, but the questions are not nearly as, I don't think, are nearly as intensive, most of them. And so my hope is that, homework number 5 won't take you as much time as maybe you spent on the first 4. So you'll get that later this afternoon. And, once again, if you have some time this weekend, you can begin at least working on the first, 2/3 of that homework. Okay, so any questions about kind of course logistics before we jump into the material? Everyone kind of clear on where we're headed here? So, and then of course, the last thing that's in this class is the final exam on Wednesday. And we'll talk about that next week. But the final exam on Wednesday will be partly new material, but then there will also be some review. So it's basically going to be about half and half, about half new material, half review. And so we will talk about that a little bit next week too. But just to give you some heads up, that's where we're headed for the final. The day before Christmas Eve. I cannot believe that we are still taking this class, but here we are. Damn derecho. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. And really, we have one last big topic in this class, and that is talking about international macro, right? We really have not talked about international issues very much. We've talked on them here or there, where we've talked about exports and we've talked about trade balances a little bit. We talked about debt crises, Wednesday, right? And talked about debt crises across countries, but we haven't talked about international macroeconomics in any substantive way. And so that's really what we're going to do here today and on Monday and on Tuesday, right? Is kind of finish up in chapters 19 and 20 talking about international macro. So chapter 19 is on international trade. And so international trade. I have here written at the top of my notes that trade is a technology for turning corn into computer chips. And you really have to think about trade that way. Trade, in some sense, is almost magical because it allows you to trade something that you do have for something that you don't have. When expressed that way, as I said, you can almost think about trade as magical, right? The ability to trade something you don't have for something that you do have. And so I want to emphasize this right off the top because, it feels like, if you're following the news or you follow current events, there's been kind of this dramatic, transformation in the way that many Americans think about trade. And, I think, I saw a recent survey that suggests that like 52% of Americans think that trade does more harm than it does good. That's astonishing to me. That's astonishing. Simply because you think about the power of trade to turn what we do have into what we don't have. It is a very, very powerful technology. And so the fact that many Americans don't understand that is shocking, right? And it really is a testament to the, I don't know what else to call it, the fundamental economic illiteracy of many Americans, right? I mean, trade is in many ways the most fundamental technology, right, of increasing your productivity and allowing yourself to get more with less is through trade. Let's just begin here by talking about some basic facts about trade. Chapter 19, or I'm sorry, figure 19.1 here, we're looking at imports and exports in the US, and we see that there's been an increase in both of these. And of course, the US runs a trade deficit, and we have since the early 1980s. So while we export a lot, we import a lot, right? These numbers, though, are actually lower than in what we see in most countries, right? So if you look at, for instance, exports as a percent of GDP, it's currently about 10, 11% of GDP. That's actually lower than it is in many, many other countries. For instance, Germany, their exports are about 45% of GDP, right? So almost half of everything Germany produces is exported abroad. And so this is true for many other countries, right? That exports and imports actually are a bigger fraction of output than they are in the U.S., where the U.S. is a relatively relatively closed economy. What's been driving this increase in exports and imports? Well, I've got a couple of things down here that are worth thinking about. First, one of the big things that's driven more exports and imports is lower transportation costs, right? The cargo container principle among them, right? So we don't think about the wonders of a cargo container, but cargo containers and global shipping have greatly reduced the transportation costs of getting goods from here to there. To get a ton of material from Shanghai to San Francisco costs about $110. Let me think about that. To get a ton worth of material from Shanghai to San Francisco, $110, right? That's very cheap. And part of it is because of the efficiency of cargo containing, which is basically standardized shipping. You put it in a cargo container, it gets on a truck takes it to a ship, you throw it on a cargo ship, it makes a slow trek across the ocean, drops it off in San Francisco, you put it on a truck, and it's there, wherever you need it to be a couple of days later, right? It's kind of an amazing thing. Government policy has also encouraged more imports and exports, right? Back in 1960, the average tariff on an import in the US was 14%. Today, it's 4%. So the US and many other countries have definitely moved towards more open borders and lower tariffs. And then I think the other reasons for the expansion is, one, there's preferences, right? Partly preferences is driven by information. Because of information technology, we have so much better information on goods and services that are offered not just in the US, but abroad. And so we have access to those, right? We have access to information about those. And so we've developed preferences for these, strange little kitschy goods from this country or that we tend to appreciate. And then technology, right? Information technology and things like that have allowed services to become exported and imported a lot more than they used to be. So, for instance, healthcare services now with what do they call it? Not mobile health, but telehealth, right? Where you can get an X-ray and have somebody read that X-ray in India, right? These things, these kind of exports and imports weren't possible before information technology. If we look specifically at the trade balance here in the US, the trade balance is exports minus imports, right? We often refer to this as net exports, right? So I could actually write this in here, right? Trade balance or net exports, right? We're really talking about the same thing, is X minus M. Exports minus imports. This is the negative of the trade deficit. The trade deficit is imports minus exports. Here you see what it is in the US. What should we say about this? Well, we're going to talk about why the US has run a trade deficit here for the last 40 years in a little bit. I will say, though, about this number, no economist actually believes it. And what I mean by this is that our measurement of what the trade balance is between countries is not really a very good measure. And the reason is that we have lots of data deficiencies. Let me explain the data deficiency. We tend to measure exports and imports in final goods. Okay? We tend to measure exports and imports in terms of final goods. So in other words, wherever the final good is assembled, that is the country of origin. Okay? So for instance, iPhones are imports into the United States. Why? Because most iPhones are assembled in China. So we tend to consider iPhones imports. But if you really look at the manufacturing of iPhones, that's not really it's not an import, right? It simply is not an import. If you look at the value added of an iPhone, only about 3% of the value added of an iPhone actually comes from China. About 50% comes from the United States and is really patents and other information value, right? So it's basically design and patents that come from Apple itself. So while most of the value of an iPhone comes from the US, we actually count an iPhone as an import because it's assembled in China and we focus on final goods. The problem here is these global supply chains, right? Most goods nowadays are not made in a single country. And so as a result, it's very, very arbitrary to pick the country of origin as just the place that you assemble a final good. And so if we could measure, if we had better data and we could measure every good in terms of its value added, this deficit in the US would be significantly smaller, right? It would be significantly smaller. But we can't do that, right? We just simply don't have the data to measure value added of every single good. And so, we use final goods and honestly, it's just not a very good way of measuring your trade balance. If we look at trade balances across the world, we see, a fair amount of diversity. Obviously, for every country that has a trade deficit, there's going to have to be a country that has a trade surplus, right? And so just looking at some countries here, we see the US and France. If we had the UK on here, we would see those countries as being traditionally trade deficit countries. Which countries tend to run bigger trade surpluses? China, Germany, Japan, right? But yeah, for every country that there's a trade deficit, there has to be a trade surplus country. If we look here at more rapidly growing countries, though, we tend to see that countries that are growing rapidly tend to have trade surpluses. And there's a simple reason for this. This is a result of policy, what we'll call export promotion. And export promotion is a very important aspect of modern development policy. The idea here is that the best way to accumulate new technology and the best way to accumulate foreign know-how and the best way to attract foreign capital is to make goods for foreign markets. In other words, to focus on goods that you can export abroad. And by focusing on goods that you can export abroad, then you can accumulate know-how, information technology, capital that allows you then to increase your industrial base, increase your productive capacity, and eventually begin making things for your own country, your own citizens, right? And so, export promotion, particularly important in East Asia, right? So China, Singapore, South Korea, all these countries aggressively followed export promotion strategies that, have shown to be very, 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 very effective in increasing their standards of living. Today, I don't know that you should say so much that that developing countries follow export promotion as they follow global supply chain promotion. Because once again, when you talk about an export, you're talking about a final good. Many countries produce lots of goods, but very few final goods. In other words, they tend to be intermediaries in these global supply chains. And so today, if you look at the trade amongst countries, one of the things you see is that goods tend not to be specialized at the final level, but at individual stages of production. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is it's not so much the case that one country specializes in making cell phones, or one country specializes in making toys, or one country specializes in making computer batteries, right? Final goods. More and more what we see is that countries specialize in stages of production, meaning a country will specialize in final assembly, which tends to be what China does, right? China tends to specialize in final assembly of goods. Other countries will specialize in, for instance, highly technical inputs, such as South Korea tends to do this. Other countries will specialize in more labor-intensive parts of production, such as Vietnam. And so, countries now, as I said, are not specializing so much in individual goods or in individual industries, but specializing at individual stages of production. This is one of the reasons why COVID was so disruptive. Because COVID, by breaking up some of these global supply chains, didn't just impact one or two industries, it basically impacted almost every industry. Because nowadays, most production does in some way, shape, or form rely upon international production services. And so, when you have a break in trade that kind of isolates a country like South Korea or Vietnam from the rest of the world, that means like a whole range of goods are going to be impacted, right? And so this is one of the reasons why you all probably are not the kind of consumers that I am, but we've been trying to do some house remodeling, and it's been surprising the kind of things that you can't get, right? Windows or small electronic. We've been looking for. We had to put some heating in our house, and like the heat monitor, they're the heat temperature gauge, right? Nowadays, these are all highly electronic. It's a very, very hard thing to find, and it's because there was a small part of the production process that broke down in, I can't remember where it was, Malaysia or something. And so these things are back ordered across the globe, right? And so it just goes to show you how trade is a lot different than it was 20 or 30 years ago, right? Where we are, in many ways, we are not trading so much in goods and services, but we're trading in intermediate phases of production. And to go back to what I was talking about earlier, this is one of the reasons why our export and import data is so misleading, because it acts like we still trade in final goods and services, but really we're just trading in different stages of production. Why do economists believe so strongly that free trade is a good thing? Well, this is something that me and other economists that you've had at Cornell and elsewhere have been indoctrinating you from day one, right? So, and I make no apologies for this, that as a profession, economists strongly believe that trade is a good thing. And why is that, right? Why is that? Well, first is this idea of comparative advantage, which I hope that you're all familiar with, right? Comparative advantage is one of the oldest ideas in economics, and it basically says that where does productivity come from? Where do increases in productivity come from? They come from specialization. Specializing in what you do best. That's the key to increasing productivity. And so individuals should specialize, but just like individuals, countries should specialize. So you guys have probably all heard me use this or ask this question. I certainly asked this question in principles. Should LeBron James mow his own lawn? LeBron is probably very good at mowing lawns, right? A 6'9", 230 guy probably can push a lawnmower pretty fast. He might be one of the best lawn mowers in the world. Should he mow his own lawn? Well, of course, the answer is no, right? He might be good at a whole range of activities. But the key to comparative advantage, the key to increasing productivity is to specialize in what you do best, not at what you do well, but what you do best. And so where's LeBron's comparative advantage? Playing basketball. He should spend his time playing basketball, and he should hire other people to mow his lawn, who might be very good at it. They may not be as good as LeBron, but relative to the other things that they can be doing, that's where their comparative advantage is. And so that same idea that holds for individuals really holds for countries, right? That both, for instance, both the US and the Mexico, both of them can gain from trade by specializing in what you do best. You know, and for those of you who've had me in principles, I think I worked through this exact example in principles. That suppose you know, and obviously this is kind of a overly simplistic, overly stylized example, but you know, suppose that you have two countries and two types of goods, right? So we have a Mexican worker and an American worker, or a US worker, and they can make two types of goods, computers or shirts. In this example I have here, a US worker, if they spend an entire day, can make 10 computers or 100 shirts. A Mexican worker can make 4 computers or 50 shirts. So the US worker has absolute advantage in both goods. They can produce more of both goods. But the key to trade is not who can produce more, but who is the low opportunity cost producer, right? In other words, who gives up the least to make something? Just like LeBron should not give up basketball to be mowing his lawn, workers from one country should not be wasting their time making things that they're less productive at. We can increase productivity for everybody if you focus on making the things that you are most productive at. And so that's what comparative advantage is. Comparative advantage is who's the low opportunity cost producer of a good, right? Who gives up the least to produce a good? So if you kind of figure this out quickly, if you look up here at the US worker, the US worker gives up 10 shirts for every computer that they make. Their opportunity cost of a computer is 10 shirts. What about a Mexican worker? A Mexican worker here essentially gives up 25 divided by 2 shirts, right? Or 50 divided by 4 shirts for every computer. When it comes to shirts, the US gives up 1/10 of a computer for every shirt, right? Once again, we're just talking about what you give up for what you get. And to get a Mexican shirt, you give up the inverse of 25 divided by 2, right? 2/25. And so notice here, now when I compare the opportunity cost, right? Let's look in this left-hand column. What's the opportunity cost of a US computer? 10 shirts. What's the opportunity cost of a Mexican computer? 25 divided by 2. The US is the low opportunity cost producer. They have comparative advantage in producing computers. But for the same reason, Mexico has comparative advantage in shirts. They are the low opportunity cost producer of shirts. To say this another way, if you look up here at our table, notice that a US worker is 10 times more productive at making computers, but they are less than 10 times as productive at making shirts. That's why they should specialize in making computers, because their relative advantage, their comparative advantage, is bigger in making computers than shirts, right? And so this idea that you should specialize in what you do best is a fundamental one in economics. And so what can happen here is that US can make computers, Mexico can make shirts, and notice that you can trade between the two at a price that's between these two comparative advantages. So if you trade at a price that's between, I'm sorry, not the two comparative advantages. If you trade at a price that's between the two opportunity costs, it can benefit both countries, because the US can sell computers for a little bit more than 10 shirts, benefiting them, and Mexico can buy computers at a little bit less than 12 halves of a shirt, which benefits them. And so that's the nature of trade, right? You try to find a price that's between the two opportunity costs, and that makes it mutually beneficial. Being mutually beneficial is at the core of trade. So this idea, the specialization, right? Specialization is, the key to making trade beneficial, is one of the oldest ideas in economics, right? I mean, you go back to Adam Smith, right? If you read The Wealth of Nations, what do you read in The Wealth of Nations? Specialization, 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 right? And so international trade allows you to specialize more, right? And that's the fundamental reason why trade is good for you. Now, there are some other reasons, though, why economists believe that international trade is good. One is it doesn't just allow you to trade goods and services, but it allows you to trade inputs. So things like capital can move to where it could be most productive, right? Capital can move from rich countries to poor countries. Why? Because according to the Solow model and diminishing marginal returns, capital should be more productive capital should be more productive in poor countries because they have less capital and they should have a higher marginal product of capital. So poor countries can attract capital because they have higher marginal products. Same for labor. If labor has a place where it is more productive, it in theory can move there. Of course, the problem with moving labor is that then you get into migration. And this all goes back to the citizenship premium that we talked about, right? Remember, the citizenship premium is that when a person moves from another country to a rich country, their expected lifetime income immediately increases. So if a person from the Congo moves to the United States, their lifetime income goes up by a factor of 92. What that suggests is that there would be huge benefits to letting labor migrate to where it's more productive. Of course, the problem with this is not so much an economic problem as it is a social problem, right? Because many people are reluctant to have huge migration into their country. We've talked about this before, but if you actually look at the data does not suggest that incoming migrants reduce the wages of current residents. And as we talked about, back in chapter 7, we talked about why that is. And that's because when migrants come to your country, they don't just increase labor supply, but they also increase labor demand. Why? Because they have human capital and they work hard and they're entrepreneurs and they're consumers, right? So it doesn't just change the number of people there, but they bring with them important inputs. And so the data suggests that it doesn't economically, right? Migrants to a country do not economically hurt current residents. But there's a lot of other social things that go on with migration, right? And I don't even feel like I need to talk about this, right? I mean, we're all aware of the fraying of the social fabric that has gone on in the U.S. and other countries, despite the fact that the U.S. has for a long time been thought of itself as a melting pot. It appears that less and less we want to think about our country that way, or at least some people want to think about our country that way. And so while most economists believe that the economic arguments for migration as benefiting the United States are very, very strong, in general, there are political and social winds here that are the bigger impediments to that. Technology transfer, right? Oftentimes, trade is as much about transferring technologies as it is about transferring goods and services. We talked a minute ago about export promotion, right? The policy followed by many less developed countries to specialize in goods that they can sell to rich countries or sell abroad. Why? Because they realize that by doing this is a great way to transfer ideas. In fact, technology transfer is right at the heart of the Romer model, right? That even if you have a small population, you can take advantage of the ideas created by a bigger population through trade. And so through trade, what you get is you get the kind of interaction, you get the back and forth. Maybe you have a foreign company come set up in your country. With them, they bring their technology, they bring their know-how, they bring their human capital, right? Oftentimes, having foreign companies come into your country is as much about transferring ideas as it is about creating jobs, right? So technology transfer is a huge part of international trade, particularly from the perspective of countries that don't have as many ideas, right? I mean, in the simple Romer model that we talked about, a country that has more ideas today is always going to be richer than a country that has fewer ideas today. But that might be a little simplistic way of looking at things, because there is a way for countries that have fewer ideas today to try to catch up in the number of ideas that rich countries have. And the way they catch up is largely through trade, right? And so we see this time and time again, right? You know, look at South Korea. You know, South Korea back in the 1950s had about 1/10 of the GDP that the US had. And South Korea was thought of, you know, quite frankly, in the way that we might think about Vietnam today, right? As a place where you make a lot of labor intensive, low technology goods. But what South Korea has been able to do over time is, starting off in kind of these labor intensive, low technology goods, but over time begin to, you know, accumulate and transfer technology from other countries, from the developed world, learn, improve their physical capital, improve their human capital. And now South Korea has really moved to the edge of technology innovation. So instead of just being a technology borrower, now South Korea is becoming one of the innovators in technology. It doesn't take place overnight, right? And the only way that you do that is by gradually accumulating ideas, and trade is a huge part of that. And so people, you know, to kind of turn this conversation back to the US, for people who think that, well, the US creates our own ideas, why do we need to trade with other countries? The fact of the matter is, even the US benefits greatly from having bigger networks in which to create more ideas, right? And so, you know, once again, why the US thinks that somehow it will improve our growth by cutting off our networks with other countries, I just don't think that there's any evidence of it, right? That even a big country like the US has a lot to benefit from being part of these idea networks and transferring ideas both out of our country but into our country. The final argument here that I'll talk about why trade is beneficial is trade allows countries to smooth consumption and investment over time, right? In other words, countries can borrow or they can save. And just like this is good for individuals, this can be good for countries as well, right? So the last figure, this is kind of small. Let me see if I can blow this up a little bit, right? But this is just looking at the growth of income in a country, which is on the horizontal axis, and the growth of trade in that country. And we find this strong relationship, right? Time and time again, that countries that grow, that trade more, grow faster. Here, the size of the dots are based on the country's population. And we see that if you look at the size of the dots, it's even more true for big countries. So, you know, I think there was a thinking in economics 20 or 30 years ago that it's small countries that had the most to gain from trade because they had small markets and small population. But no, right? Even big countries, even countries like China and India and the United States have a lot to gain from trade, right? And so this is just something that is not controversial amongst economists, right? It's just not controversial. So why is it so controversial in our politics? Well, let's talk about that here for a minute. Why is protectionism so popular? Well, I think, you know, there's some pretty obvious reasons why protectionism is so popular. One of them is just simply special interests. Trade has beneficial impacts in the aggregate, meaning at a macroeconomic level, it increases growth, it increases standards of living, it creates new ideas. But it does create some winners and it does create some losers. And we know this, right? Because if you think about it, this is the key to specialization. As you move towards specialization, it means that you're going to have a reduction in the number of, how should I say this, industries. As we specialize as we specialize in a relatively small number of goods, it's going to mean that other industries are going to disappear. In this way, once again, trade is very much like technology, right? What happened when CDs were invented? Well, the cassette tape industry largely went out of business, right? That's probably a good thing because the audio quality of CDs or MP3s is much higher than it was of cassettes. Vice versa, trade is probably going to mean that some industries in the US leave while other industries grow. But of course, that creates some losers, right? And so, this is the problem behind the cost jobs argument. That many people want to argue that trade costs the US jobs. Well, it costs the US specific jobs, but then it creates other jobs. The problem is we tend not to see the benefits, we tend to focus on the costs. So everybody kind of focuses on the jobs that are lost, but we rarely focus on the jobs that are gained from trade, right? I think, there's also a lot of political scapegoating. And by that, I mean, it's a lot easier to blame foreigners when an industry is struggling than it is to blame the industry itself or, the managers or even the workers, right? And I think a lot of that goes on in the US. A lot of things get blamed on China, as we're going to talk a little bit more on Monday and Tuesday. A lot of things get blamed on China that are really US problems, right? that basically result from our trade policies, from our fiscal policies, right? So, for instance, as we're going to talk about, the US trade deficit is largely a function of our macroeconomic policy, not of China's policy, not of Europe's policy, but our policy choices. And so while it's easy to blame China for having a trade deficit, in large fact, it's our fault, right? It's because of the decisions that we have made. So most economists think that, really what should be done here, the policy response to this, is that we should be thinking about taxing the winners and subsidizing the losers. Through things, how should we subsidize the losers? Through things such as education, right? By spending more money on retraining, by subsidizing people to move to different parts of the country. And how should we be paying this? By taxing those industries that are thriving because of trade. But the US does very little of this, right? We spend very, very little money, for instance, on retraining workers. Once you get out of college, U.S. government is not going to hardly spend a penny on you, right? And they may not spend that much money on you even when you're in college, right? But for a 35-year-old person who just lost their job, there is very, very few resources out there to help them go back to school, to help them get technical training, to help them move. We don't do any of this stuff. And doing this stuff would be, quite honestly, money very well spent. And so, I think this has been a big problem with U.S. Trade policy over the last 20 years, is that we have not spent nearly enough trying to help the losers. And so losers, I don't mean this that they are losers. I'm talking about the fact that they've lost their jobs, right? And so the people who have lost their jobs have not been helped out. And so all this has done is led to growing resentment, particularly in those parts of the country that have, that have suffered the most. And in the US, this tends to be more rural areas. And so a lot of the fact that we have this big rural-urban divide is just simply the fact that we have not spent enough time trying to compensate the losers from globalization. And we've just let the winners take all the benefits, right? And so, those benefits have largely been concentrated in urban areas and specific urban areas, right? And so we have not spent nearly enough time or effort trying to redistribute the gains from trade. And that has been a huge political mistake because it's really undermined the public support for trade. That's really the reason why protectionism has gotten so popular. I mean, this is the fundamental reason. And, there's a lot of other reasons why people talk about protectionism. Some of it is just nationalism. And by this, I mean that many people have said that really we don't care about anybody other than Americans. Right? This whole national security idea that a country is put at risk because we trade with other countries. It's crazy. Quite honestly, it's crazy. Just to give you one example of how insane a lot of our trade policy is. And oftentimes the insanity has just been explained away through national security, is through cotton subsidies in the United States. So if the US government did not subsidize cotton farmers, we would not grow cotton in the US anymore, right? Because honestly, most of the US is not a particularly effective place to grow cotton, and we have comparative advantage elsewhere. But the US government, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that we need to grow cotton. So we subsidize cotton growing. Most of cotton is grown in Louisiana and Texas. Let's think about the typical cotton grower in Texas. There are 300 cotton growers in Texas. Each of them get about $150,000 subsidy from the US government every year. So we subsidize 300 farmers at the price of $150,000 a year so that we grow cotton in Texas and we don't import it from abroad. This costs US taxpayers about $4 billion a year. Are we really safer because we don't grow our own cotton? No. No. And where this hurts the most is, of course, it hurts US taxpayers. But who it really hurts is, for instance, subsistence farmers in West Africa, who are hurt by these cotton subsidies because these cotton subsidies force down prices and they remove a major market. So West African farmers are hurt because they can't sell cotton to the US. The US is going to buy our own cotton. As a result, we hurt the most vulnerable, in addition to end up wasting a lot of money so that we can grow our own cotton. And that's typically how these nationalistic national security arguments work, right? Everybody thinks their own industry is a national security interest, right? Okay, I could keep on going on and on about this. Listen, this is not the class to kind of get into too much of politics or whatever. I just kind of leave it here to say that, as maybe you can tell by the tone of my voice, I've gotten increasingly frustrated with the quality of the discussion about trade because, really, it feels like it's really the level of ignorance about trade and the way that it's been politicized, um, politicized is very, very sad. And here, I'm not necessarily talking about one political party, right? Um, I'm talking about populism in general, right? Which is growing both in Republicans and Democratic circles, right? And so, trade has shown itself, at least in U.S. history, to be a fundamental aspect of increasing ideas and increasing productivity and making us rich. And so, the fact that it appears like in a lot of our national discussions, we want to just stab ourselves in the back is really just kind of amazing to me, right? It's the self-defeatingness of the way that we've been talking about trade here in the U.S. the last 5 to 10 years is really amazing. And part of that is because we have not enacted the policies that we should have been enacting to try to spread out the benefits of trade more, right? And so trade, the way that we've conducted globalization has contributed to inequality because we have very much let the winners keep all the spoils and let the losers suffer for themselves. And so it's been a disaster in many ways, and I'm afraid it's only going to be more of a disaster as we move forward if our discussion continues to be conducted in the way that it's been conducted the last few years. Okay, all right, stepping off my pulpit. Let's take a break for 5 minutes. Let me collect myself. Take a 5-minute break. I have maybe about 15 or 20 minutes worth of new material to talk about, and then we'll move on to talking about the exam, okay? All right, so take a little break. Back in a few. All right, calling everyone back here. So before we get started here, I want to alert you guys to a couple of opportunities. I'll probably do this again next week. Um, but I want to alert you to a couple of opportunities that are coming up here that I think many of you in this class might be poised to take advantage of. So I want to encourage you to think about it. The first is, I just found out this week that been given the tentative green light to offer my China class next December, basically this block next year. Ben went on it last year. You can't do it again, Ben. Well, actually, you could do it again, Ben. If you want to think about it and come back and do it one more time, you're absolutely welcome to. But anyway, so of course, a lot of this is dependent upon other things. But I think I think all signs look pretty good for being able to go back to China next year, block 4. So in other words, this block. So I want to just kind of put all of that on your radars. Registration is going to be happening here in about a couple of months. But to really be think about it is a fantastic opportunity. I think it's a really amazing experience. Of course, you can talk to Ben, or probably all of you know somebody else who's been on the course in the past, or hopefully know somebody else who's been in the course. Feel free to talk to them. Come talk to me if you're thinking about it. But I really would like to encourage the juniors here to think about taking the class, because it's really a great opportunity, not only to visit a pretty fascinating place, but also to kind of learn a little bit about economics in practice. So that's one opportunity I wanted to alert you to. The other thing I want to put on some your radars, once again, this is mainly for the juniors, is about the Cornell Summer Research Institute. So I don't know if you're all familiar with the Cornell Summer Research Institute, but this is basically an 8-week institute where you can stay on campus and you can basically be involved in a research project. For that, you get paid $2,500, right? So you get basically some support to be on campus, and you get paid $2,500. So I've decided I'm going to take on one student this summer. And so what this means is that we would kind of work together. I mean, a lot of this is independent work, but I would kind of be there to supervise you on a research project of your choosing, or something that we kind of work on together, or a topic we come back together on. And then you'd also get to participate in the other things that go on in the Research Institute, such as professional development, thinking about, what it means to be a researcher, how do you present results, that kind of stuff. So anyway, it's a pretty great opportunity for those of you who are interested in going a little bit deeper and doing some independent research. And so, as I said, I think I've got approval for one student this coming summer. And so those of you who just gotten through intermediate macro, you might be good candidates to think about that. So if you haven't thought about your summer plans yet, or this sounds like something that would be interesting to you, reach out and talk to me, and then we can kind of continue the conversation, as things go forward. Okay. All right. So I'll probably say a couple words about that again next week, because it would be nice to get one or two of you involved in these things. Okay. So let's go back and talk about this question about why is the U.S. trade deficit so large and persistent? My simple answer is it's just simple math. Right? It's simple math. It's actually math that we've worked through before. In fact, we did this We've done this a couple of times in class. But let's go back to our expenditure question or equation. Here's our expenditure equation. Let's add and subtract transfer payments, and let's add and subtract taxes. And then I'm going to group things together. You've seen me do this before. Put this collection of terms on the left-hand side. And this on the left-hand side. And I'm going to write this a little bit different than I did before. I'm going to put I on this side. And on the right-hand side, we'll leave exports and imports. Okay. What's this? Private savings. What's this? Government savings, or the negative of the budget deficit. What's this? I is investment, and this is our trade balance. So another way you could say this is that it has to be true that total savings, remember total savings here is government savings and private savings, minus total investment is equal to the trade balance, is equal to exports minus imports. This is math, right? This is math. And why am I emphasizing this is math point? Because trade balances are not impacted by China policy or European Union policy. The trade balance is not impacted by these. What determines the trade balance? Our savings and our investment. The difference between the two determines our trade balance. So, what's true in the US? In the US, we have big government deficits. And we have low private savings. What does that do? That means that our total savings is less than our total investment. How do we make up the difference? We run trade deficits. Part of being a trade deficit means that we are a foreign borrower. So in the US, we have big government deficits and low private savings, meaning that S is less than I, and as a result, we have a trade deficit. The flip side of having a trade deficit means that we are a foreign borrower. We borrow more than we save abroad. Do we run a trade deficit because of Chinese policy? No. It's because of our domestic policy that we run a trade deficit. It's because of our domestic policy that we run a trade deficit. So think about it this way. Domestic policy determines our trade balance. Trade policy determines the levels of exports and imports, but not the difference between the two. Right? So our domestic policy determines the difference between the two. But it doesn't determine the level of exports and imports. Or, I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull something up online here to show you, and I shouldn't be Googling while at the same time I'm talking. Domestic policy is what determines the trade balance, right? But our trade policy determines how much exports and how much imports we get, but it doesn't determine the difference between the two, right? So why does the US run a trade deficit? Because we continue to save too little. Our government doesn't save at all, and our public citizens actually save relatively little. As a result, we run trade deficits. This is a basic fact of the world that economists understand, but most politicians don't understand. And once again, it's very frustrating. President Trump has acted as if we can get rid of our trade deficit through trade policy, but you can't. Let me say that again. You cannot get rid of the trade deficit through trade policy, meaning putting tariffs on Chinese goods is not going to get rid of the deficit. All it's going to do is reduce the level of exports and imports. If you don't believe that, well, look what's happened during the Trump administration. Not surprisingly, economists could have told you, oh, there's a nice support, legalize marijuana, nice. This is the figure I wanted to show you. Look at what's happened to the trade deficit under the Trump administration. Trump has put all sorts of tariffs on Chinese goods and other countries' goods to try to reduce our imports. Has it reduced our imports? Yes. But it has also reduced our exports. And so what's happened to the deficit, meaning the difference between the two? The difference between the two has continued to go up. Why? Because we're running bigger government deficits, right? I mean, if Trump or any politician was really serious about reducing our trade deficit, we would reduce our government budget deficit, but we don't do that. And so this is so predictable, right? This is so predictable. You're not going to get rid of the trade deficit, particularly we're not going to get rid of the trade deficit with China simply by putting tariffs on Chinese goods. We would have to save more, right? That's the way that we would do it. And so, if you look here at the data, we just see this time and time again here. Here's the phenomena of the twin deficits in the US. The twin deficits are these two lines here at the bottom. The budget deficit, the government budget deficit, and the government trade deficit. And these are fairly closely related. Not perfectly, but pretty closely related. As we run bigger budget deficits, we tend to run bigger trade deficits. And so why has the trade deficit gone up under Trump? It's gone up because the budget deficit has gone up under Trump, right? The US is not going to solve that by putting tariffs on Chinese goods, because ultimately the impact of this is on, or the cause of this is US domestic policy, right? Same for our net foreign investment position, meaning how much do we borrow abroad? Well, as we continue to run deficits, we continue to borrow from abroad. And so this graph basically shows the amount of borrowing that the US as a country is doing. And yeah, we see that this is increasing, right? That basically our borrowing abroad is about 50% of GDP. Most of this is really from government bonds, right? That as we talked about, when was that, Wednesday, that 30% of our government debt is held by foreigners. And so that's a huge way in which we are a net foreign borrower, is we issue government bonds and a lot of them are bought by foreigners, right? They're not bought by, or most of them are bought by Americans, but a big chunk of them are bought by foreigners. And so that's why we are essentially a debtor to the rest of the world right now. So just to kind of we summarize this to beat this point over the head. We have a trade deficit, meaning our net exports are less than zero, and we are a foreign borrower. Why? Because our savings is less than our investment. We have low savings relative to the relatively high levels of investment. But for the US to run a trade deficit and to be a foreign borrower, there has to be countries out there that run trade surpluses and are foreign savers. And of course, the big country is China. With the US, they run a big trade surplus. And they are a foreign saver. Why? In part, this is part of their export promotion. Part of the export promotion strategy is that you have to be a saver. So in many ways, there's many ways that the Chinese government encourages its citizens to save and not invest. So as opposed to US government policy, which tends to encourage consumption and tends to not encourage saving, both through our big budget deficits and also through tax policy and other public policies in China tends to be much more heavily focused on encouraging its citizens not to spend and to save. And so, you know, if we think about China in particular, we can think that this strategy has had some good things for China, but it's had some bad things for China. The good is export promotion. Which has led to technology transfer and jobs and growth. That's probably the obvious thing. But we should also be cognizant of the fact that this also has severe consequences for Chinese citizens. And one of them is your average Chinese citizen tends to save and not consume. And as a result, they have relatively low standards of living. So for those of you who've been to China, I don't know if any of you have been to China other than Ben, but I think Ben will attest to this, what we saw last December and what I've seen definitely over the years, is if you look at, you know, for instance, a middle class, if you go into the home of a middle class Chinese person, basically they live a much more humble life than we would here in the US, right? In other words, you know, for somebody that's making an equivalent purchasing power parity income in China, their standards of living are lower, right? How they actually live in terms of how nice their house is, the quality of the food they buy, how many vacations they go on, right? I mean, their actual standards of living are a fairly significantly amount lower than they are here in the US, right? And part of that is the consequence of export promotion policy that has really disincentivized consumption and made consumption relatively expensive relative to saving. And so, you know, this is one of the costs of this strategy, right? Every strategy in economics has costs and benefits. One of the big costs is while it's led to a lot of growth in China, actual standards of living, meaning actually how people live, has not really kept pace. I think another bad thing for China is they end up lending cheaply to the US. So here's a country that's poor relative to the US, that has a lot of needs, and yet what does the Chinese government or the Chinese economy do? It's an example of a poor country lending to a rich country so that the rich country can live a nicer life than they already are, and it's harder for the poor country to actually increase their standards of living. So China is lending billions of dollars to the US, billions, trillions of dollars to the US, and they're lending it at essentially what there are zero interest rates, or in terms of real interest rates, they're lending money to the US at negative real interest rates. At some level, it's kind of crazy, right? There is a big opportunity cost to this. And by that, I mean, China could likely be doing much better things with the money, much more productive things with the money. But yet, they're very, very wedded to this export promotion strategy. So this is kind of the situation that the US and China have been in. You might call it kind of like a codependent relationship, right? Where the US longs for trade deficits because we love to consume. China longs for trade surpluses because they want to accumulate more technology transfer and jobs. But yet, in the long run, I'm not sure that it's good for either country to be that reliant on the other, right? And for this to be that out of whack, right? And the question here isn't, you know, whether China should have a trade surplus or not, or whether the US should have a trade deficit or not. I think it's really a question of size, right? Is the deficit and is the imbalance between two countries sustainable? And I think a lot of economists really worry that the level of the imbalance is unsustainable, that China should be moving away from export promotion a little bit towards more balanced growth. And so should the US. The US should probably be moving towards an economy where we do more of our own savings and less of borrowing from abroad. But, you know, there's cost to doing that. There's cost to doing that. And it requires some political leadership, of which the US and maybe China is in relatively low supply. So anyway, that's where we are in regards to international trade in the US. So where are we going to move on Monday? So Monday and Tuesday, we're going to actually spend 2 days talking about the final chapter, chapter 20, where we talk about international macro. So some of the last topics that we have to finish up here is we're going to talk about exchange rates, talk about exchange rate management, those kind of issues, right? So, and then we're also going to talk some about how exactly do we put these international issues into our short-run macro model, okay? So we're going to go back and talk a little bit about our short-run macro model and how we can incorporate some of this stuff into the models that we've already developed, okay? So that's for Monday and Tuesday. Remember, Monday, your paper is due. Remember, Tuesday, your homework number 5 is due. I will send you homework number 5 right after class, right, in the usual agenda for Monday. Okay, so any questions about all that? So if not, let's talk about your exam. Okay, so the exam, the average, as I think I told you in the email, was a 62. It was very close to the average for the first exam. That doesn't mean that there weren't some big improvers. In fact, there were a couple of you who did showed a real nice improvement. In fact, there were more people who improved on this exam than did worse on this exam. So I was happy about that. So while the average doesn't really show much improvement, I think if you actually look at individuals, there were more people who improved than did not improve, and a few of you improved by a fairly significant amount, which was good to see. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe some of my other overall takeaways about the exam is, once again, it appears that time management appeared to be a bit of a problem. I think some of you really had some questions that you didn't even attempt. And I don't know if that was time management or just simply being lost at how to do the questions. But I think that did hurt a few of you. And then, honestly, probably the biggest distinction between those who did pretty well and those who did less than well on this exam was getting some of the easy questions right. I mean, some of the more definitional questions or questions right out of your book. There were a couple of questions on the exam that were essentially rewording of questions on your homework. And so, for those of you who did well on those questions, then at the end of the exam, you did pretty well. And for those of you who struggled on these things that were kind of more straightforwardly right from our lectures or right from our notes, that's where you got into trouble. So let me very quickly go over the exam. All right, I'm going to go over this, fairly quickly. Let me remind you before I go over this, though, that half of your final exam is going to be review, right? Half of it's going to be review. So some of these questions might be showing up again, if not in the same form, in different form. And so if there's things that you're really still confused about, this is a good time to ask questions about it. All right. Okay. So question 1A, I have to say I was very disappointed with how we as a class answered this, because it feels like we've talked about this many, many times, and yet still a few of you are confused about what we mean by the short run and the long run. The short run is not a specific amount of time. It's not a year or 6 months or one period, right? In macroeconomics, the long run is trend behavior, and the short run is deviations from trend. We also talk very importantly about another important distinction between the long run and the short run. The long run, money neutrality holds, and in the short run, money neutrality does not hold. In other words, markets are perfectly competitive in the long run. They're not perfectly competitive in the short run. What determines the slope of the IS curve? I didn't write it down here, but it's B, right? B, which is the elasticity of investment, how sensitive investment is to the interest rate. Suppose that a pandemic takes place that causes a large loss of life. What should happen? Provide an ISMP graph to illustrate. Let me put this graph here on my. So in this question, and let me say, honestly, all of these questions, I do try to keep an open mind. I do actually try to read what you wrote. However, let me say that in this answer, while I'm open to multiple answers, one of the things that's going to determine whether you get full credit is, do you actually use the model, right? Do you use the model, or are you just kind of spitballing, right? And so for me, here's the answer that I think is the best. This is not the only answer I accepted, but this is the answer I think is best. That what happens when you have a reduction in labor? We know that with less labor, oops, that should be a negative. We know that less labor is going to reduce the marginal product to capital. That should reduce R bar, and that should reduce your IS curve. And so to me, this seems like the most obvious answer to this question. That IS should shift down. Right? assuming that the MP curve stays where it is, we should have a recession. We should have negative short run output. Some of you argued, well, with less people, that means less consumption, so maybe A bar goes down. And depending upon how persuasively you argued it, I accepted it. For some of you, you just kind of said, well, the IS curve falls, but you didn't explain why the IS curve falls, and so that meant that you lost some points, right? Because you really need to explain to me what's happening within the model, right? Within the model. Okay, and then finally here, consider the following addition to our simple model where household consumption is also affected by their ability to borrow. How is this consistent with the permanent income hypothesis? Well, this is consistent with the fact that people would like to smooth their consumption, but they face borrowing constraints, right? So people have to borrow to smooth their consumption over their life. And what does that mean is they have to pay a penalty for borrowing. And so, so I think this is consistent with the permanent income hypothesis that people would like to borrow to smooth their consumption, and they have to pay an interest rate. So assuming the rest of the model is the same, derive the new IS curve. For some of you, I think I put these steps in for those of you who missed the math. If you got the math right, I did not substitute this in. I'm just going to kind of jump to the bottom. And what do you find? Well, really, it's the same IS curve, except now you have two B's. The first B is for your elasticity of investment. The second B, BC, is the elasticity of consumption. And so what happens now is interest rates impact spending in two ways. Interest rates not only impact investment spending, but it affects consumption spending. The IS curve becomes flatter. What does that mean? It means now when there's a change in the interest rate, there's going to be a bigger change in short run output, right? So the IS curve becomes flatter, and now when there's a change in the interest rate, there's a bigger change in short run output. That actually makes monetary policy more powerful, because now when the Fed changes the interest rate, it's not just going to change investment, it's going to change consumption. So a lot of you did very well on this question. A lot of you got this, and I was actually heartened by the fact that for some of you who didn't quite get the math, or you got the math a little screwed up or whatever, a lot of you were still able to kind of intuit using the model what you should find happen, all right? And so that was good, right? That was good. And I tried to reward those who, even if you got the math wrong or didn't derive the right IS curve, were able to kind of intuitively think through what was going to happen. And so that was good. Question number 2, the Phillips curve. Why does the aggregate supply curve slope upwards? Once again, I got a lot of answers here. Many of them had nothing to do with our short run macro model. In our short run macro model, why does the aggregate supply curve slope upwards? Capacity constraints, V bar, right? So as capacity constraints get stricter, you get bigger changes in inflation for any change in short run output, and it becomes steeper aggregate supply curve. Part B, suppose that COVID leads to a suspension of global supply chains that temporarily increases the cost of production using aggregate demand, aggregate supply. What should happen in the short run? What should happen in the long run? So what should happen here is that this is a negative supply shock, right? And a negative supply shock is an increase in O. So what should happen in the first period is aggregate supply should shift to the left, and we have a recession. That's what happens in the first period with output going up. What happens then in subsequent periods? Aggregate supply comes back down as people's expectations adjust. and we move back to the long run level of output. This was an example right from your class notes. We did this exact example in class. Okay? In class, we talked about the productivity slowdown that's occurred in the US since the 2000s. Assuming that this unexpected decrease in productivity was mismeasured, and that policymakers adjusted policies so mismeasured level of short run output was 0. This question is the same question I gave you on homework number 3. The only thing I did this time was on homework number 3, it was an increase in productivity. This time it was a decrease in productivity. So it's the same question, I just flipped it. And so the idea here is, as I have written down, if trend output falls, but the central bank doesn't know it, it's going to think that it's a fall in short run output. Not a fall in trend output, but a fall in short run output. If they think it's a fall in short run output, they will try to increase short run output. That will make short run output actually positive, and that's going to lead to inflation. Okay? So this was, as I said, once again, exact example from homework number 3. Likewise, questions D and E were just like the question on homework number 4, other than instead of a negative demand shock that you had in homework number 4, there was a positive demand shock here, and I changed a couple of the numbers. But this is basically the same problem, right? The same problem with the exact same setup. So some of you struggled with the math, right? Still had problems struggling with the math. But once again, if you provided intuition and if you provided a graph to kind of explain what you think you should have found, then I gave you full credit, or not full credit, but I took off very little points. And so I'm just going to give you the answers here. I'm not going to do all the math for you, but I really encourage you, if you're having a hard time with this question, you got to work this out yourself and see if you can get the right answer. And then if you can't, send me an email or whatever, and I'll send you the answer, right? But I really want you to work this out yourself, because, watching somebody else do the math is never nearly as effective as you yourself doing the math. But what you should find in period 1 is that aggregate demand goes up, so that increases short run output and it increases inflation. And then in period 2, aggregate supply shifts to the left, and so short run output goes down a little bit and inflation goes down a little bit, right? In other words, if I could share a graph. What happens in the first period? Aggregate demand goes up, and Y1 is positive, and inflation is positive. And then what happens in period 2? Aggregate supply comes back a little bit, so short run output goes down. And inflation goes up. Okay, so that's what happens in the first 2 periods. Now, so that's period 1, that's period 2. Your graphs are getting kind of confusing here, so I tried to be very lenient here looking at your graphs. The question is, what happens in period 3? In period 3, aggregate demand comes all the way down to where it was before. But aggregate supply continues to respond to what happened last period. So now, period 3 comes all the way down here. What we should find is that now short run output goes down and is actually negative. Well, inflation falls a lot. And then finally, what happens in period 4? Now, aggregate supply shifts to the right, and short-run output should get closer to 0. Okay, so this is, in fact, this is the exact example we worked through in class. In class, I worked through a positive aggregate demand shock. This was the same example. You could have reproduced to the extent that you could reproduce my graph, you could have reproduced this graph, and that was good enough for this. So for those of you who used your intuition, who messed up the math but used the intuition, once again, I tried to be very generous on this, but you kind of had to be able to explain this. And so I think a number of you those of you who didn't do very well in these last 2 parts, it was as much for not doing the math as not doing the graphs, right? A few of you did not provide the graphs, or you kind of had the intuition messed up, and so that was, probably a bigger penalty than even not doing the math correctly. Okay. Question number 3 on inflation and stabilization policy. Define the quantity theory of money, both in terms of levels and growth rates. Why do people hold money in the quantity theory? I didn't put in the equations here. I should have. But remember, the quantity theory in terms of levels is this, or in growth rates, it's this. Money growth plus velocity growth equals inflation plus real output growth. Why do people hold money in the quantity theory? To spend it. In other words, people hold money to spend. That's the only reason that people hold money in the quantity theory. So in the quantity theory, what does money neutrality mean? Money neutrality means that changes in the money supply do not impact real variables like velocity or real output. As a result, changes in the money supply only affect nominal variables like inflation. So if the money supply goes up, inflation goes up proportionally. Discuss 2 reasons why inflation is sticky. If inflation is sticky, what happens to the ex-ante interest rate relative to ex-post real interest rate? So I think some of you struggled with answering this question about why inflation is sticky. We talked about 4 or 5 reasons in class, and I wanted you to talk about those reasons. These reasons included menu costs. They related to imperfect information. What are some of the other ones that we talked about? We talked about efficiency wages and the fact that wages don't adjust because firms are reluctant to cut wages. We talked about coordination failure. I think we talked about one other one. I can't think about it now, but I wanted you to talk about at least 2 of those. Okay, finally, part D. D is the hardest question on this exam. To me, it's the hardest question. Not because it's technically hard, but because it's, how should I say, the intuition seems a bit backwards because it's kind of an extreme example. So consider the simplified version of the Taylor rule, where monetary policy depends only on short-run output. Only on short-run output. So in other words, the only thing the Federal Reserve thinks about is short-run output. How would this change our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph in our diagram? Well, I think the easiest way to think how this would change is to plug this money rule into our IS curve. So this becomes our IS curve, right? If you plug in for R minus R bar, if you plug in N bar times Y tilde, this becomes the IS curve, right? Right? This is our IS curve. Then you plug this into your the aggregate demand curve, and this becomes your aggregate demand curve. So the algebra here is very, very simple, right? Very, very simple. Notice here, though, that this is a very strange aggregate demand curve because inflation is not an argument in this. Inflation is not an argument. What does this aggregate demand curve look like? It's basically vertical. Right? Aggregate demand becomes vertical. Short-run output is always equal to zero. Why? Because the central bank, all that they do is target short-run output at zero. What this means is you're going to get lots of variability in inflation, right? If there's a demand shock, right? Let's say the demand moves out here. What should the Fed do? They're just going to move aggregate demand right back to keep short-run output at zero. But what that means is that you're going to see every time that there's a demand shock, it's going to be entirely reflected in a change in inflation. So inflation will be much more variable, but output is going to be targeted here around the short run, around zero. Okay? That is kind of intuitively a difficult thing to conceptualize, right? And so that's why I say this was a hard question, because it's kind of hard to think through the intuition of this. I think a couple of you derived the aggregate demand curve, but you really weren't able to make the next step, that what this means is that the aggregate demand curve is actually vertical and that we're always at short run output of zero. Why is this called crowding out? Well, remember when we talk about crowding out, we talk about government spending pushing out private investment with higher interest rates. But here, what we have is monetary policy pushing out private investment with interest rates. So for instance, if A bar is less than zero, what does the Fed do? The Fed reduces interest rates so that we have a big increase in investment. But if A bar is greater than zero, the Fed raises interest rates so that investment goes down. And it's only through investment that the Fed is stabilizing aggregate demand, right? So it's in that sense that it's crowding out. And once again, that's a hard question. Quite honestly, that's a hard question to kind of make that connection. So I wanted to give one question out there that was really, kind of maybe pushing your boundaries a little bit or asking you to really think deep. And this question, in part because it's a very unusual question, right? It's weird to think about a monetary policy rule without inflation. All of the ones that we've seen have had inflation. So I wanted to push your boundaries a little bit. And that was the purpose of that question. I tried to be generous in giving partial credit. You may or may not think I was generous, but I tried to be. All right, finally, last question here. We're running close out of time. Define timing consistency. Timing consistency is when the short run the optimal policy in the short run is not optimal in the long run. So in other words, the policy that is best for today is not the policy that is best for the future. And so, for instance, low inflation is a classic example of a policy that's time inconsistent. Low inflation is best in the long run, but in the short run, low inflation can mean shorter output or lower output. What are two ways policymakers can deal with this? Well, we've talked about establishing credibility, we talked about transparency, and we talked about rules, right? All three of those are ways that you can try to deal with this. Consider the following bank balance sheet. The bank has $200 of defaults. What happens to the leverage ratio? So remember, leverage is assets divided by equity. So before this crash, assets were 5,800 and equity was 300, and so the leverage ratio is 19. But what happens after you've lost these $200? Your assets go down by 200, but your equity goes down by 200 as well. Right? So whenever you lose something on the asset side, you have to lose something on the liability side. Losses have to come out of equity. So what happens to the equity ratio? It's 56. In other words, it's almost tripled. What actions is the bank going to have to do? They're either going to have to cut their assets by panic selling and stop lending, or they're going to have to raise more equity, maybe through a bank bailout, right? That's really your only options. Part C. Here we have a question about the European debt crisis. Why did this impact other countries? Can you explain? And once again, what I was looking for here is explaining this in terms of our short-run macro model, which a few of you just kind of wanted to explain, but you didn't really put this in the context of our short-run macro model. And so, you know, how I would have preferred you to answer this is to say, whenever you have a financial crisis, even if it's in another country, it's likely to have two impacts. First off, it's likely to increase this risk premium. Why would this impact other European countries? Because other European countries do business in France, do business in Greece. So, you know, they've lent money to Greece. If Greece is going to default, now their lending is much more risky. And then also, this is likely to reduce their wealth because other countries likely hold Greek bonds. And so if the Greeks default on their bonds, that's going to be a decrease in wealth of other countries. And so what should happen? Both of these things should reduce the IS curve, and they should reduce aggregate demand. Actually, I'm not even going to, in the interest of time, I'm not even going to draw up the graphs, right? But these are going to look very much like the graphs of the 2008 financial crisis when we talked about it in class, right? And it doesn't, in some sense, because finance is international, it doesn't really matter which country it happens in, right? If you have exposure, financial exposure to that country, it's almost like you have a financial crisis. And that's essentially what's happened in Greece. The last question here, finally made it. Last question is, during the global financial crisis, the Fed moved away from focusing on interest rates. Why? Because they drove interest rates to zero. That's the liquidity trap. So what did they focus on instead? What specific policies did they adopt? Well, we talked about three, and I wanted you to talk about two of those. One is that they bought up other assets, like quantitative easing, like long-term government bonds, to try to reduce risk and to increase liquidity. They also adopted forward guidance, meaning they tried to stabilize expectations by giving markets a longer term view of what their policy was. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about this. You didn't have to talk about everything, but I wanted you to have some specificity when you talked about some of the policies that the Fed conducted during the global financial crisis. Okay. So just in conclusions here, I know that we're running a little bit over time. Yeah, you know, there will be a curve on this exam, probably just like the first one. If you need to put a grade on this exam, you can probably add 10 points, maybe a little bit more towards the bottom of the scale and put it on a 90, 80, 70, 60 scale, and that gives you some rough idea of how you did grade-wise. Once again, though, improvement matters. I also think that on the final, there's actually a good opportunity to make up some lost ground for many of you, in part because the new material on the final is not as difficult and there's not as much of it. And then also because I think, you know, the review material is going to be stuff that we have talked about all along in this class. And so my hope is that not only can, you know, seeing this stuff for the second or third time that you can do better, but coupled with the fact that the new material is a little bit easier, the final gives you an opportunity to make up some lost ground if you feel like you didn't do as well on this exam as you could have. So anyway, I'm happy to talk with all of you individually today. I have a little bit of time, probably about a half an hour here after class, to talk with a few of you. Or if you would prefer to talk this afternoon, send me an email. Remember, my two best windows are between 1 and 2, and probably 2:30 to 3:30. So so I'm going to end it here. If a couple of you want to stay on now and talk, we can do that. Or, as I said, just send me an email and we can set up a Zoom time to meet this afternoon, okay? All right. Well, thank you for your attention this week. We've ground through week 3. We're getting close to the finish line here. Good luck. I'll be checking emails. So if you have any questions about the macro paper or homework number 5 that I'll send out in a little bit, I look forward to them. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone. Enjoy yourselves.
Hi, Todd. I was wondering if you had a moment to talk. Oop.
Sure. So how about, Rose, I'm going to invite you to a breakout room. Okay, I'll meet you there in a minute. And the rest of you, if you just want to hold on, I'll come back from the breakout room and talk to you, okay?